Hi guys and welcome, Demon here. Minecraft 1.14 is bringing to us a very interesting and useful block. And it's not the new furnaces. It's the Jigsaw block, which funnily enough is not for survival and neither for creative. It has no function, but it's a very useful tool for world generation, and we can use it to manipulate world generation by changing the data that the game is using. One thing before we start. To have it working, you currently need to modify the game jar file, but you won't be touching anything with the game code. I would assume that at some point the control over these will be moved to the datapacks, which is the same type of data or NBT structures that are shipped with the game jar, just defined outside of it. So I'm expecting that some vanilla purists probably gonna argue that what we'll be showing here is already modding and not vanilla, but the truth is even changing a game rule is also changing some game data in the same way it's not vanilla as well. The matter of the fact is those changes that I will be showing here today are of admin type, which has the same flavor as datapacks. So some basic info about Jigsaw blocks. You can obtain them in Creative by giving yourself a Jigsaw, and in Creative you can look up its interface, where we have three pieces of information. First argument is a target pool, which is the pool of structures that can be generated from that block. Unfortunately, these lists are currently hard-coded, but I was informed that this will change at some point in some future versions, but not in 1.14. Second parameter is a structure tag, and these are not hard-coded, so we can put technically whatever you want, but in practice you wouldn't put things like a single capital letter because it will crash your game. So it's not a foolproof system yet, but you can request whatever you want. And by using the tag, we'll make sure that the structure that we are connecting to uses the same tag in a connecting Jigsaw block. And the last argument is a replacement block that this would transform into, because Jigsaw blocks disappear from the world once they generate. So in this particular case, it will just vanish, being replaced by air. Unfortunately, since there are real blocks, real full blocks in the NBT structure, this will wreck, for example, path blocks below them. So that's a little annoying, but still quite workable. There are in general two types of connectors. One what you can call an active connector, or the one that has specified bits in the target pool, and this one will be actively searching for a matching structure with that specific tag. And the other type would be like a female connector or a passive connector that will only match the connection if that structure is added to the already generated structure. So it won't search actively for more connection options from that point. So here are very simple modifications that we can apply, for example, to a Taiga village. Here I'm using the 19W03C, which in newer versions those villages are slightly a bit different, but it doesn't matter. So here what we pulled out is a village center. So the town center defines how this structure starts, so you can change it as well, but you can change it to essentially modify the entire village, but we'll go to it in a bit. And I changed that town center to more like a Christmassy vibe. So we have this Christmas tree over here, but in general the structure is not changed too much, it's just added a little bit of bits to it. And the other modifications we have to that village is we are adding a hospital building. So in this case I was experimenting with different sizes, and this one is 11 by 17. When I was increasing the size, any of those sizes a little bit bigger, I noticed that those structures stopped popping out, so it seems like this is the limit for that particular layout. So in your particular case you need to experiment a little bit with your city, trying to get a feel how big of a structure you can fit in a city. In general, the smaller the structure, the likely it will fit. So in the front we have a little wind catcher, so because it's in the cold biome, so we have to have double doors, and this gives also a lot more doors to the village structure. Then after we pass through, we have a little lobby, so we have a little counter, so it might be like a villager here sitting at the counter. It looks pretty cool. And then we can go to the next room, which is for like slightly ill patients. So we have a bunch of beds like in a hospital, a bunch of benches over here for guests to sit on. We have on the left we have a little place for the doctor to hang out, so we have here some potions, and we have in here a barrel, just golden apples, and we'll have a villager here as well. So looking upstairs, we have rooms for slightly more ill villagers. In this case, so we can treat them well, we have a little bit more extra equipment that might be useful to transfer them to the lower section as well. Unfortunately, Jigsaw blocks for this particular village don't allow you to spawn zombie villagers, and we want them not to despawn anyway, so with a persistent tag. So I'm here just spawning normal entities and I'm saving them in the NBT, which is possible, so they will show up in each village, in each hospital the same way. So that would be the entire building, and that's what we want to paste in our world. So now we need to patch the game. In this case, I will be patching the server file. The problem with client and the single player game is the fact that you have this manifest, you have to get rid of and change the JSON, game JSON, for it to work properly, so it's more sneaky. With servers it's very easy, they're very lenient, you can change whatever files you want and it'll still work fine. So what I'm doing here, I'm opening the server file as a zip folder, okay, with the 7-zip, and I'm just navigating down to the structures, and we have to find the specific village we want to modify, okay? And I've already changed the town center, so that's not a big problem. Now we have our structure that I copied 5 times, and we'll be replacing 5 existing buildings just to increase the chances for our building to be selected in world generation, so we can demonstrate it better and paste it into our world. And from now on, when we run the game and the game finds a new village that it needs to generate, it will use our structures inside that village. And that's it. We didn't have to change any code, anything. We just need to change a bunch of NBT files, which look exactly the same if you would, for example, modify a data pack, except we have to here modify the actual game jar. So now we just need to run the game, and we can log in and check how it generates. So I have created a little buffet type world with Taiga only, so we can inspect all the villages around us. And I found this very interesting one, which had 3 hospitals in one village. Typically you would see either 0 or 1, that's what I've seen, by replacing those 5 buildings that I just replaced. In this case we have 3, so that's interesting. So this is the one over here, and right next to it is the second one, rotated the other way around, and as you can see, generated just fine. But there's a small detail that's important maybe to note. Here on the sides I was using some andesite blocks just to mix and match textures, not use only cobblestone. This is something that you have to be wary about. If you use stone-like blocks, they may be replaced with other stone-like blocks. But if you really have to, you can always use double slab block, which will never be replaced with anything else. Going through, here is our tree, which is the center. Here we go to the other side of the village, which is our 3rd village. One thing we can note that it's a little funky, because it seems like the lake has generated after the village and ate half of it. And that's something that the order of certain features might be problematic. I would say that the lake should generate first and then the village on top of that. That would prevent those kind of weird situations. But that's no. Just throwing in up there that this might not be the best order of things. Yeah, but it's still functional. You can see the button still works. It's finding those new updates. So as you can see, to replace 1 or 2 buildings with some new functionality from the village so they randomly spread around the world is actually not that big of a deal. It's actually a very simple operation to do. But now let's try something different, something more interesting. So we are here in the demo world published by Slime, who is one of the developers in Mojang team. And we'll be doing some more complex example where we'll be redoing the entire town and converting it to a bustling, hustling city, like you would, for example, see like in the middle of deserts, like for example in US, Nevada, Las Vegas, Reno, what have you. However, to understand how the village is structured, because some of those things are hard-coded, we need to look into the game code. So here's unfortunately where the most important bits lie, something that could easily, I think, be moved to JSON files and even controlled by datapacks. Hopefully they could consider this for the future, but currently we have to work what we have right now. So we are in 19W03C, crudely run through the vanilla fern flower, so nothing special. This is just for us to realize what's going on. And this is the file that defines the Taiga village components and how they are put together, for example. So at first we can notice that we have some familiar pool of objects. So first we have our town centers with 2 of them that are defined for Taiga village. Then we have our streets. There are some Terminators which we'll be going back to in a moment. So those are all the streets that are present in the Taiga village. Then we have all the houses as well, with the whole list of them. Then we have Terminators, and Terminators are, as you can see above, they can be used also as in replacement for streets and houses, so we have to define them as well. And there are some decor pieces which we don't have to use, and villagers at the end. Couple of things. First of all those files that we have in the NBT, because those point to specific NBT files, have to be defined exactly in the files. If some of those objects are missing, for example, we forget to add it back in the game will crash loudly when we encounter a village to generate. So you have to make sure that when you are overriding a village, you have to override all the pieces and name them exactly the same way as in the game. So that's one limitation. We can use that many different pieces of different types of roads and that many pieces different types of houses, but that's pretty much it in terms of main limitations, in terms of the type of structures, a number of them. A couple of things to note. You can see that each structure has this marker here, CAF-AB and CF-AA, and if you go to CAF, you can notice that A is for structures that are terrain matching, so they will fold up and down as the terrain goes, like for example for like paths and things like that. And then some of them are rigid, which means that they will just be placed like that without any changes to them. But as we have seen just moments ago, they can be still ruined by things like generated lakes inside of them. One thing to add to it is if we look at the definition of the CAF of the constructor, we see here we have those numbers over here. And if you look at this code, we can see that this number, essentially the second item in that pair, essentially defines how many times that structure gets added to our random pool. Which means that, for example, in this case, for example, in Taiga's farmers are 8 times more likely to be found than clerics, which is interesting. So we can manipulate also the probabilities that our certain buildings will be found inside world generation. So you can see most of them are roughly the same times, like 1, 2, and 5 times. So, but it's something you have to keep in mind when you'll be replacing those structures with your own ones. So the general idea behind those cities is to create some sort of like a street grid-like structure and put buildings in between those spaces, and so we have the entire structure quite very regular. However, there's a problem a little with how jigsaw blocks can be used. So here's a bunch of experiments I did previously trying to define those types of connections that will give us directionality, which is important if you're, for example, defining a grid. So my first attempt was to have some sort of, this is a street connector, this is a mail connector that connects to north, and this was supposed to match another north connector that's in the next tile, and in the opposite corner we have, for example, an empty south connector that should be able to generate a south tile at the bottom. So we have some sort of north, south, east, west with these here tags like north, east, and so on. So this should work perfectly fine. Like if you think about it, if you have a tile generated which is oriented one way, we have this male connector which is pink in this case, and then it will connect to a, let's say, the female connector. That's essentially what we would want to happen. And then we have other connectors on each side, so we can continue generating our city, and that would be an ideal situation, let's say. However, the problem is that since we are pulling from the same set of structures, so this will be our house, and this will be our house, or this will be our street, and this will be another segment of this street, this connector can technically merge with exactly the same structure, just rotate it and connect with the same type of connector. So that's the problem a little bit, because if you, for example, look at the jigsaw blocks, if you have an extending bit, it cannot fit in the other extending bit. So in this case, there's a little problem, and they use it in the actual village to be able to connect various types of roads to each other. But it would be really nice if we, for example, could somewhere in the jigsaw block just specify that it will only, like, let's say, connect to connections that have empty, for example, in target pool. So it will only connect to a connector that essentially is supposed to match it rather than to itself. Because this way we cannot really control the directionality, and if we are pulling from the same set of structures, like in this case streets or houses. So the only way to assure directionality is to use tags, obviously. So you have our different types of like north, east, west, and so forth. And then these has to be from a different set of pools. So we'll show you in a little moment how we can use this trick to generate a proper city. But our first attempt is more kind of straightforward here. So we have a city center, which is over here, which is just essentially like a crossroad with a little bit of figure in the middle and some lamps. pretty cool stuff. And from that we have our street connectors going all the directions. And in this case we are working with streets of wide width of 9 blocks, and then buildings will be 11 blocks width, so all these plots. So our street elements, so in this case the crossroad is 9 by 9, but our street elements in this case are 9 by 11. We have 2 types of buildings, which in this case is just here we have one big skyscraper with 5 valid village doors. So we have here a door in the middle, actual door, and then we have those 2, like 4 on the sides, which will also be valid village doors, so to expand the village to larger numbers. And if you go inside, you can see we have a bunch of staircases going up the floors, we have our beds, and in this case we have our villagers that will be spawned stuck inside those end rods in the middle. End rods give a little bit nice vibe to it, and they are far enough from the ice block so they don't melt, and it will be going in a spiral fashion through all the floors up, and at the end we have our roof, and that's essentially our structure. That's 11 by 11 by 32, so all the limit that we can use. At the front, as we can see, we have a female connection, which is using the building entrance tag, which is exactly what vanilla is using to connect buildings. And here we have a little Terminator, which in this case is like a little parking lot, because we cannot really do anything with the Terminators, unfortunately. I mean, if you would put other jigsaw blocks, like for example trying to connect some other bits and pieces, unfortunately this is also hard-coded. I don't know why, because you don't have to use those jigsaw blocks if you don't have to, but if you put those jigsaw blocks here, you wouldn't be able to connect anywhere else from that Terminator. So that's a little bit of wasted opportunity, a little hard-coded stuff, but whatever. So here we have 2 street components, very basic ones. Here we have connections to other parts of the streets. And here on the sides we have active connectors to connect to the houses through the building entrances. And those are 9 by 11, so they will match the building size, so they are very regular. And this is a crossroads section that also has 2 outstanding houses, because I decided to add a little road to it. The problem is, when we have this kind of a crossroads setting, technically other street can connect to it, but it's not guaranteed that will connect through the front of it, so we can technically draw another crossroad and attach to it, and this looks a little ugly, so we'll be giving low priority to those kind of crossroads. So we'll be mostly having straight connections in our city. However, randomly we'll be able to get some random street going somewhere else. Oh, there's one more thing. So here we have a little garden, which we'll also define as a house, with a bunch of places that will spawn a lot of cats. And the garden in front they have 2 connectors. So first one is the regular building entrance, so it will essentially accept any connection from the street, so they can be accessed from the street. But the other one is for our exit, and the exit, here if you go to the back of the building, I define here exit from that house that will point to another house through the exit connector. So hopefully we'll be able to get a garden in the back of some buildings, but actually instead we'll have something else. But that's the problem I was talking about the male and female connectors, that they sometimes want to connect male to male. So we'll see in a moment how this pans out. And here our first setup that we have come up with, and a couple of observations. You can see that the roads are sticking to the ground and going with the terrain. It doesn't look that good, to be honest. Thankfully we've added a little bit of extra blocks below the road, so whenever the road shifts we don't see this sand popping over all of the place. But it would be nice if we could manipulate the terrain that generates under those streets to a little bit flex them to the buildings, but not too much. I might be asking for too much, I don't know. However, we can change the time. Let's change it to night. You can see that our city is looking really nice due to lighting we have in our buildings. But there you can see there's issue with gardens. So we were supposed to have gardens at the back of the buildings, but if we see, there are other buildings which are just faced back to back. The problem is that we had these male connectors that connect to the exits that are at another house, and those houses, they also had those male connectors, so essentially the house is connecting to itself, just rotated 180 degrees, which is not what we intended to do, so unfortunately we cannot do it this way. However, we'll be using a specific trick in the moment to show you that we can actually do it, but you have to select different pools. So that's our first village. It's not looking really bad, it's actually looking pretty decently. However, there's not pretty too much variance in terms of the structures. The structure is very flat of this town is not really appealing. So let's try something else. So this is our second approach to the village. In this case, we'll be using only 3 structures, actually 4. We have to define the Terminator, but this will be just empty. In this case, we have plots that are, I think, 16 by 16. No, they are 17 by 17, because we don't want to have odd symmetries. So the city center is like that, it's just a structure like that, it will be pasted in the world. In this case, what we want to add, if you look at the street component, we want to add half of the road into each street tile. And the thing is, we can have those street tiles rotating at any point, which means that if you build them symmetrically, we wouldn't need to worry about it. But the problem is, our streets will have this double thick bars going across, which will not look that great, to be honest. And in this case, the buildings, our buildings, here we have 4 connectors for the houses, which are just the same, indicating that we can have a building inside that space. And that's our buildings, which is exactly the same as the other one, we just left the pavement over here, which means that this is only 9 by 9. And this is as high as we can go, essentially the same type of building as before. The only difference here, because these Terminators here could replace any street or any building, since we don't want them to mess up the entire thing, we just define an empty Terminator so it doesn't interfere with our village structure or town structure. So that's a new approach to build a city, and it should be regular, should be a regular grid. However, we'll have only 1 house in each spot. Fortunately, we are limited very much by the size of the structure block, which is 32 blocks across, and we can't really do anything about it. So let's see how this one looks like. Yeah, we could have expected that, to be honest, and it doesn't look really good. Those are like individual houses just connected with those thick roads. You cannot really, yeah, it's not really looking too great. And also at the edges of it, as we can see, we have to do something with the Terminators. We have created those empty Terminators, meaning that at the edge of the cities we'll have those empty plots, and we cannot really do anything about it. This will just look ugly. Because if you would, for example, assume that the Terminator is a road, some plots would have those pieces of roads inside of them, which will look pretty weird. So yeah, so that's essentially a failed experiment. However, interesting approach to use just 3 types of tiles to spawn the entire city. But hey, we can do better. And that brings us to a different types of approach. So in this case, we'll be using a trick that I came up with, where we'll be essentially defining some tiles that are streets as houses. That will help us quite a bit. So the main problem with defining a town was the fact that if we had a road, for example, and if we defined, for example, a crossroad, these crossroads could generate other crossroads next to them. It will be a little bit weird and a little bit odd. So in this case, what we are doing is we have our, obviously we have our city center, which we have to have anyways. We have our house, which is 11 by 11. Then we have the road section, which is just a straight one. And this section will connect to up to 4 houses. So in this case, we'll have a grid of 2 by 2 groups of buildings connected with roads. So the question is how we can ensure that we will be connecting roads to crossroads and crossroads to roads. And the key is that, first of all, here we have our female connector to the street. So this connector won't be able to generate any streets from it, but it will be able to connect to anything that attempts to spawn a street. So that's essentially our direction that we'll be going. And on the other end, instead of connecting to another street segment or a crossroad being a street segment, we connect to a crossroad that is the house. So in this case, we have our all house connectors on the side, but then this will always attempt to spawn a house of type crossroad, and that's what we have over here. So that's our acceptor for the crossroad, which is a house, technically speaking. And this house will not connect to another houses because technically it could connect to itself, but it connects to streets. So the streets is the only really the straight section. However, for the crossroads, we'll be using some of the houses definition. So we have essentially in the city 2 types of houses. So we have our proper building that will be connected here with the building entrance tag. So the same as the other one, that is left unchanged. However, these crossroads are essentially our other types of houses that we have in the city. And we need to balance, so we have a proper probability for each of them to appear. And here we have a bunch of Terminators. I think I will be using just an empty one, just so it doesn't mess up. I don't like the Terminators, how they're implemented right now, how they are trying to spawn everywhere. So we'll be using an empty one. So what this would do is we will be able to have this grid like 2x2 pattern of houses, enforced by the fact that our streets never connect to another street, so they always connect to a house, any shape or form, even if this is a crossroad. An extra benefit of crossroads being houses is the fact that houses are rigid by the code, which means that we don't need to worry about them being deformed in any shape or form. So we can actually assume that those will actually look exactly like we have over here. And the only deformations we might have is in the roads themselves, which is not so much of an eyesore really. So let's see how this town looks in practice. And here in the game, it's actually looking really nice. We have those regular grid pattern. And since we have sampled roughly evenly the crossroads and the buildings, the problem is like if you would only put like 2 of the buildings to do the crossroads and the rest to do those skyscrapers, the problem would be that the game would eventually very quickly run out of crossroads because it will be selecting a building and the building doesn't match a specific tag. So you have to evenly distribute them across all the types of houses in your when you're copy pasting the structures. And if you don't do it, you'll end up with very small cities. In this case, we have generated quite a big cities, and they spawn actually quite far. If we can see, there is lots of villagers there, so it's a hustling and bustling city, so it's actually pretty nice. It turned out really good. So before we end, let's try one more thing. So this is another type of a city, and in this case, we want to achieve kind of a street and avenue layout, like for example, you'll see like in New York and cities like that, which are characterized by shorter and longer section of roads. So if you look at the town center, we can see that some of the connectors go into avenues and some of the connectors goes to the street segments. And yeah, so if you look here, streets have a female street connector from one end, and they connect on the other end to our house, which is a crossroad. And the avenues have avenue female connector at the beginning. They also have the house connectors, in this case more of them, like 3. Unfortunately, I cannot go any further because of the limitations on the structure blocks, which is 32 blocks. So we even had to shrink the house to a measly 7x7. Yeah, 9x9. So we can actually fit 3 of them in one section. So that's unfortunate. But heck, what we can do. And then this avenue section connects to a crossroad type 2. And the only difference between them is the type of connector. So a crossroad type 2 will connect straight to another avenue and to the sides to streets, as we can see, and the crossroad type 1 will connect forward to another street and sideways to an avenue. I think I got them messed up. I think street should be called an avenue. I think one is longer, whatever, doesn't matter. But by having those 2 crossroads, it means that we'll always maintain the directionality. So that's really interesting. And then we'll have our Terminator at the end. We'll see how it pans out. And that's pretty much it. So we have one type of house, 2 types of roads, one going one direction, second going the other direction, which are essentially defined when the town is started from the town center. So we have here a differentiator between different types of roads. And then we have to have 2 types of crossroads, which is 2 types of houses, to essentially make up this grid proper. Fortunately, this means that we are using 3 types of housing, and to get a big city, we have to evenly pretty much get them distributed, which means that we have to sacrifice a lot more variety of different buildings just to have the grid layout proper. But you can manipulate it and you can select buildings that are more probable from the list of structures for that city and only leave those rare buildings so we can have a different variety of different buildings at the end. So here in the game right now, checking out our city, and we can see this nice layout of streets and avenues. It looks really good, and the city generated really well and really big, so that's awesome. As I was saying, the problem is that in this kind of setup we'll have limited number of buildings of certain types we can use, but at least we can generate a really nice city. So that will be it, guys, for today. A couple of cool ways you can use the new Jigsaw block from the world admin perspective and customize your world generation with individual custom structure pieces. If you, for example, want to include some non-vanilla aspects of the game and need a building for it and want to bake it to the exploration aspect of the game, you can just change one building in one village and let it spawn randomly in a world. Or you can customize your entire towns by modifying the NBT structures for the entire village components. As I have indicated, there are several limitations that we need to work with. You cannot really redefine the new connection components and pools because they are still hard-coded into the game, but you can fully customize all the bits and pieces of each village, plus define its full structure with the new Jigsaw blocks and custom connection tags. Still, there's a problem that male connectors from the same pool will want to match to another male connectors from the same pool, so it might be really hard to make, for example, some custom dungeons, like structures with some sections with linear progression. Also, the fact that some pools like Terminators have certain hard-coded features to them, like they would never expand any further, it's a little bit annoying, but in general that's quite a flexible system that allows to modify the vanilla experience quite dramatically, and without the need of changing the actual game code. At the end, I would like to leave you with a small challenge of taking one of the existing new vanilla villages and trying to transform it in some different way, trying to get something completely different, and please let me know if you have come up with something interesting. In this case, I was using a minimal number of variants for each structure type, but you can achieve much better complexity if you flesh out different types of streets and houses with different structures. Remember that you can use different tags to differentiate how your town or dungeon or city or something else gets formed. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave me a like, leave your suggestions here in the comment section below, subscribe if you are new, and see you in the next one. Bye bye!